If I pull this trigger, the world will watch your daughter die." Ivan Kovacs screamed the words across the barricade, and Caleb Navarro's finger froze above the trigger. He had no shot, no time, no chance. The little girl stared through the chaos, straight into his scope, as if begging him to do the impossible. His spotter, Logan Price, whispered, "We're out of options. We miss, and she dies." Then the terrorist's head exploded. No flash, no sound. No one saw the shot. Just death, delivered with surgical silence. Who was Maya Holden, and how did she make that shot? You're watching Veteran Biker. If this is your first time, type 1. If you never miss an upload, hit 2. And if you believe some justice doesn't wait for permission, subscribe now. The world shrinks down to a pinprick of light when you look through a sniper's scope. Everything else, the cold December air, the distant sirens, the frantic chatter in your earpiece, fades into a meaningless blur. All that matters is the triangle of danger in your crosshairs, the terrorist's finger, the child's head, and the unforgiving concrete barrier. Caleb Navarro, a man whose life was a tapestry of calculated risks and successful odds, felt his gut twist into a tight, cold knot. This wasn't just a risk. This was a mathematical certainty of failure. Through the magnified lens of his rifle, a high-powered 338 Lapua Magnum, he saw every detail with agonizing clarity. The child, no older than 8, her face streaked with tears, her small body trembling against the brutalist concrete of the loading dock, a shield that was also her prison. Her mother, a silent, motionless form nearby, a dark stain of blood seeping from a head wound, a brutal reminder of the cost of defiance. The terrorist, Ivan Kovacs, a former Spetsnaz operative turned mercenary, screamed into the wind about government corruption and revenge, his voice a broken, guttural roar that carried across the valley. His eyes, even from this distance, held a manic, unhinged gleam that Caleb had seen on too many desperate men. A look that spoke of a man with nothing left to lose, a man who saw his final act as a righteous, fiery culmination of his life's pain, a look that always, always ended in tragedy for those caught in his path. Beside him, hunkered against the biting wind, was Logan Price. Logan was more than a spotter. He was Caleb's anchor to reality, a human calculator of wind speed and bullet drop, a voice of reason in the chaos of a firefight. Right now, reality was a cruel mistress. He was hunched over his Kestrel weather meter and ballistics calculator, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the freezing December temperature. "Boss, we're looking at 2,300 meters with these crosswinds," Logan muttered, his voice strained and thin, a stark contrast to the howling wind. "And it's not a steady wind. We're getting 15 to 20 knots from the northwest, and it's shifting every 30 seconds. That's not a variable, that's a hurricane. And that concrete barrier, it's a death sentence. It's blocking 80% of the target, and what little we can see is a fleeting, random exposure." Caleb adjusted the parallax on his scope, his mind racing through every conceivable angle, every ballistic permutation. The abandoned industrial complex where Kovacs had taken his hostages was nestled in a deep valley between two steep hills, creating a natural wind tunnel that made precision shooting nearly impossible. The terrain itself was a conspirator. The terrorist was positioned behind a formidable concrete loading dock, with only his head and a fraction of his shoulder occasionally visible when he leaned out to shout his demands. It was a fleeting, unpredictable target protected by an almost impenetrable shield. Even with perfect conditions, even if the wind died down to nothing. This is a prayer shot at best, Logan continued, his voice tight with a raw, professional frustration, a sound of utter helplessness that was more terrifying than any battle cry. His words were a bleak litany of mathematical certainty, a relentless march toward a conclusion of inevitable disaster. 1 degree off, and the bullet drifts just enough to clip the kid. 2 degrees and it misses the target entirely, and then he kills her out of spite, out of a pure bloody-minded rage at being thwarted. It's a lose-lose. There's no margin for error here, Caleb, not with those variables. We're not talking about skill anymore. We're talking about a goddamn miracle, a roll of the cosmic dice that we have no business taking. Through his earpiece, Caleb heard the tactical commander's voice, a rising tide of urgency that felt like a cold wave crashing over him. Overwatch, we need a solution. Negotiator says he's escalating. We've got maybe 2 minutes before he starts executing hostages to prove he's serious. The weight of those words, of that ticking clock, settled on Caleb's shoulders, a familiar, crushing burden of impossible decisions that he had carried for 2 decades. In his 20 years as a federal sniper, he'd made shots that others called miraculous, shots that bent the rules of what was possible, threading a needle of steel and velocity through chaos and wind. But this felt different. This felt like being asked to defy gravity, to rewrite the fundamental laws of the universe with a single high-powered bullet, all while a child's life hung in the balance, a fragile thread waiting to be cut by a maniac's whim. The pressure was a physical force, a tangible weight pressing down on him, threatening to crush his resolve, to splinter his years of training and expertise into a fine dust of futility. Every fiber of his being, every instinct honed over a lifetime of service, screamed at him to find a solution, but his mind, a cold, calculating machine, could only deliver one answer: there was none. The silence in his own earpiece was the sound of a man facing the end of his professional world, knowing that the only way to win this game was to somehow cheat the universe itself. He could see Kovacs's finger on the trigger, the minute, almost imperceptible movements that preceded a kill shot, the flexing of the knuckle, the tightening of the muscle. These were the movements of a man preparing to take a life. "Logan, what if we wait for the wind to die down?" Caleb asked, a flicker of desperate hope in his voice, though he already knew the answer. It was a question born of desperation, a last futile attempt to find a path where none existed. "Weather report shows it's only getting worse," Logan replied, his voice heavy with the grim finality of a death sentence. "Storm front moving in from the west. The gusts are going to get stronger. Boss, I've run this calculation 6 different ways, from every possible angle, with every conceivable adjustment. The variables are just too extreme. We're talking about threading a needle in a hurricane from 2 kilometers away. It's mathematically zero. The probability of success is a non-existent number." Below them, Kovacs pressed the rifle barrel harder against the child's temple. Caleb could see her lips moving in what looked like a silent, desperate prayer. Her father, a man Caleb could only see as a shape of pure agony, was bound and gagged nearby, struggling against his restraints so violently that blood ran down his wrists. The scene was a grotesque tableau of helplessness and rage, a living nightmare played out in broad daylight for the world to see. Caleb's thumb brushed the safety on his rifle, a purely reflexive action, but he didn't move to fire. He was a professional, a protector. He would not, could not, risk the child's life on a shot with a 0% chance of success. The ethical and moral weight of that decision was heavier than his rifle. "Command be advised, we do not have a clean shot," he reported, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, a bitter admission of failure. "Repeat, no clean shot available from this position. The target is shielded, and the winds are too erratic. Any shot would have a high probability of hitting the hostage." "Copy that. Overwatch, "Stand by for alternative solutions," the commander's voice crackled, but Caleb knew there were no alternatives. Any ground assault would result in a bloodbath. The negotiator had been trying for hours to establish meaningful dialogue, but Kovacs seemed more interested in making a statement than in survival. This was a man who had come here to die, and he intended to take innocents with him. The only way out was through the impossible. Caleb watched through his scope as Kovacs raised his voice again, his movements becoming more erratic and violent. He grabbed the little girl by her hair, lifting her partially off the ground, a cruel, monstrous act that sent a shockwave of rage through Caleb. He felt his finger instinctively move to the trigger, even though he knew the shot was impossible. The final squeeze was coming. The moment was upon them. 30 seconds. "Maybe less," Logan whispered, his own eye pressed to a spotting scope, his voice a ragged whisper of a man counting down to disaster. "He's working himself up to it. I can see it in his body language. The end is near." The wind howled across the valley, a mournful sound carrying with it the distant wail of sirens and the heavy thrum of helicopter rotors. News crews had gathered beyond the perimeter, their cameras trained on the building where a child was about to die, while the best snipers in the country watched helplessly. Caleb felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold as he watched Kovacs' finger begin its final fateful squeeze on the trigger. The world seemed to slow down, every second stretching into an eternity of dread. And then a new agonizing detail. The little girl looked directly at Caleb through the scope, as if she could somehow see him across the impossible distance. Her eyes, filled with tears and a heartbreaking innocence, held a trust that broke his heart, the pure faith of a child who believed that someone, somewhere, would save her. It was a silent plea, a hook that pierced his soul, a moment of connection that transcended the chaos and the distance. Then, impossibly, a crimson mist exploded from the terrorist's head. He crumpled like a puppet with cut strings, his weapon clattering harmlessly to the concrete as the child stumbled free. Silence, a profound, ringing silence descended upon the valley, broken only by the wind. The world, which had been racing towards a horrifying climax, now stood still, caught in the breathless aftermath of a moment that defied comprehension. The crimson mist, a brief, violent punctuation mark on the scene, hung in the air for a second before being swept away by the merciless December gusts. Below, the little girl, a living miracle, stood frozen, her small body splattered with the blood of her captor. Ivan Kovacs, the man who had held them all captive in a web of fear and despair, lay motionless on the concrete, his weapon a harmless piece of metal beside him. What the hell just happened? Logan's voice, usually a model of calm, professional command, cracked like a teenager's as he frantically swept his spotting scope across every possible shooting position in the valley. The sound of his voice was not one of a trained spotter, but of a man whose reality had just been shattered. His hands, which had been so meticulous with his ballistics calculator, capable of dialing in fractions of a minute of angle, now trembled so violently that the scope shook, rendering his frantic search useless. He wasn't looking for a shooter anymore. He was looking for an explanation, a logical anchor in a sea of impossible data. The terrorist, Ivan Kovacs, lay motionless in an expanding pool of blood, a perfect surgical headshot that had somehow threaded itself between the hostage and a concrete barrier that should have made the shot not just difficult, but absolutely impossible. Caleb felt his own hands trembling, the high-powered rifle suddenly feeling like a dead weight, a relic from a world that no longer existed. He tried to process what he'd just witnessed, but his mind, a machine built for cause and effect, was seizing up. 1 second, Kovacs had been squeezing the trigger, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, his eyes burning with a manic gleam. The next, his head had simply exploded. There was no warning, no telltale muzzle flash from any of the hills or high-rises. There was no echoing sound of a distant rifle report, no whisper of a bullet breaking the sound barrier, just a sudden, silent, surgical death delivered from nowhere. The reality of it was a cold, hard slap to the face, a brutal confrontation with the undeniable truth. They had a dead terrorist, a living child, and an unassailable truth that was more terrifying than any enemy they had ever faced. They hadn't fired the shot. The universe, it seemed, had a sniper of its own, and she didn't play by the rules. "Did you see a muzzle flash? Anything?" Caleb demanded, his voice a disbelieving rasp, his mind still grappling with the sheer impossibility of the moment. He was a man who lived by logic, by the predictable laws of physics and ballistics. What he had just seen violated every single one of those laws. But Logan was already shaking his head, his face pale as parchment, the color drained from him by a shock that went deeper than just the adrenaline. "Nothing, boss. I was scanning the entire grid when it happened. No flash, no movement, no disturbance of any kind. It's like the bullet materialized out of thin air. I mean, I've seen some things, but this is different. This is wrong." He paused, checking his notes with shaking fingers, his mind desperately trying to make sense of the new, terrifying data. The angle of impact. "Caleb, this is impossible. The bullet came from the northeast, but we cleared that entire sector. There's nothing there but empty construction sites and that old crane. It would have been impossible to get a line of sight." Through Caleb's earpiece, the disciplined silence of the tactical frequency shattered into a cacophony of chaos. SWAT teams, their professional calm giving way to frantic urgency, were moving in to secure the scene. Medics, their sirens screaming, were rushing toward the hostages. Commanders, their voices sharp with a mix of relief and disbelief, were demanding answers that no one possessed. Below, the little girl, now a living miracle, was sobbing uncontrollably in her father's arms, both of them alive against all odds. But Caleb felt no surge of relief, no wash of professional satisfaction. Instead, a growing dread, cold and corrosive, settled in his stomach like a lump of ice water. The simple, clean victory had been tainted, irrevocably soiled by an impossible, unexplainable act. "Command, this is Overwatch," Caleb reported, his voice a masterclass in professional control, a deliberate Herculean effort to sound sane in a world that had just gone mad. "Target is down. Hostages appear secure, but we did not take the shot. Repeat, we did not fire." The words tasted like a lie, a betrayal of everything he stood for, but they were the only truth he had. The radio crackled with a storm of confused, angry responses. "Overwatch, confirm your last. Did you say you did not engage?" The commander's voice was sharp, a dagger of disbelieving authority. "That's correct, command." Shot came from an unknown position. "We're trying to locate the source now." Caleb swung his high-powered rifle toward the northeast, his gaze sweeping across the construction zone that Logan had mentioned. The area was a maze of half-built structures and abandoned equipment, a perfect canvas for concealment, but an impossible one for the shot they had just witnessed. The distance alone would have been a Herculean challenge for the world's best snipers, but the angle was what made it truly impossible. The bullet had somehow, inexplicably, curved around obstacles that should have blocked any direct line of sight, defying the very geometry of the terrain and the fundamental laws of physics. "There," Logan whispered suddenly, his voice tight with excitement, the shock giving way to a frantic search for answers. "The construction crane, about 2 clicks out. I caught something just for a second, a glint, a heat shimmer." Caleb shifted his scope to the massive yellow crane that dominated the construction site. It was an old tower crane, the kind used for high-rise construction, with a long horizontal jib that stretched out over the valley. The operator's cab was empty. had been for months, according to their intelligence, but something about it nagged at Caleb, a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. The angle was all wrong, though. Even from that height, the shot would have required the bullet to pass through solid concrete. It was a physical impossibility, a violation of the most basic laws of ballistics. "Run the ballistics," Caleb ordered, his voice a low, cold command that was less an instruction and more a desperate act of defiance against the unexplainable. He already knew what Logan would find. The numbers would scream the same impossible truth. Logan's fingers, which had been so meticulous with his calculations, now flew over his calculator with a frantic, desperate energy, inputting the wind speed, the staggering distance, and the trajectory data with the haste of a man trying to outrun a ghost. After several minutes of this frantic, futile calculation, he looked up with an expression of pure, gut-wrenching bewilderment. The color drained from his face. "Boss, if the shot came from that crane," he stammered, the numbers a foreign language to him now, a nonsensical series of digits that no longer made sense. The bullet would have had to travel 2,300 meters, compensate for a crosswind that was shifting every 30 seconds like a living thing, and somehow pass through a gap between concrete barriers that's maybe 4 inches wide. And that's assuming the shooter could predict exactly when Kovacs would move into position. What's the probability of making that shot? Logan stared at his calculations for a long, agonizing moment, the numbers on the screen a mocking testament to the irrationality of the moment. Then he looked up, his eyes meeting Caleb's with a mix of awe and terror, a look that said he had just seen God and found him to be a sniper. "Mathematically, 0. It's a non-existent number, boss. Even with perfect conditions, perfect equipment, and perfect timing, the variables are too extreme. You don't just need skill to make that shot, you need to be able to see the future to know exactly when to fire." The statement hung in the air, a final damning verdict that sealed their investigation into the realm of the impossible. As SWAT secured the scene below, Caleb caught something in his peripheral vision, a glint of light from the crane's operator cab that hadn't been there moments before. By the time he swung his scope toward it, there was nothing but empty air and shadows. But the feeling of being watched, of being evaluated by unseen eyes, crawled up his spine like ice, a cold dread that someone, or something, had just shown them a power that they couldn't possibly comprehend. "Logan, get on the radio. I want that construction site locked down and searched immediately. Every building, every crane, every piece of equipment," Caleb ordered, his voice now a controlled, cold instrument. "Already on it, boss." Logan was speaking rapidly into his radio, coordinating with ground teams. But even as he gave orders, Caleb knew they wouldn't find anything. Whoever had made that shot was already gone, vanished like smoke in the wind. The forensics team was arriving now, their white vans pulling up to the perimeter. Soon they would recover the bullet, analyze the trajectory, and confirm what Caleb already knew. They had witnessed something that defied explanation. A shot that was impossible had saved a child's life. And somewhere out there was a shooter who could bend the laws of physics to their will. Caleb kept his scope trained on the crane for another 20 minutes, watching for any sign of movement, any clue that might explain what had happened. But the construction site remained still and empty, holding its secrets like a grave. The only evidence that anyone had ever been there was a dead terrorist and a living child, and the growing certainty that Caleb had just encountered something far beyond his understanding. The simple, clean lines of his professional life had been shattered, replaced by a complex, terrifying mystery. The chaos on the tactical frequency gave way to a grim professional efficiency. SWAT teams, moving with practiced precision, had secured the hostages. The little girl, now sobbing in the arms of her father, was being checked by medics. The scene was being processed, a tapestry of human tragedy and miraculous escape. But for Caleb Navarro and Logan Price, the mission was far from over. Their pursuit had just begun. Their target wasn't a man with a gun. It was a ghost with a rifle, and the ghost was everywhere and nowhere at once. Logan, his composure slowly returning under the weight of his training, was meticulously cataloguing every detail of the construction site. "It's a needle in a haystack, boss," he muttered, his voice still tinged with awe. "We've got ground teams sweeping every square inch, but there's no way they'll find anything. Whoever made that shot, they weren't humanly there." The phrase hung in the air between them, a terrifying acknowledgement of the impossible. Caleb lowered his rifle, the weight of the weapon feeling foreign and useless in his hands. It was designed for a world of predictable physics and measurable variables, a world that no longer seemed to exist. "We traced the impact," he said, his voice flat and determined. "The bullet had to come from somewhere. The angle doesn't lie, even if everything else does." He and Logan moved from their concealed position, their focus now shifting from observing to investigating. They joined the forensics team at the scene of the crime. Detective Dr. Layla Voss, the FBI's lead ballistics expert, was already there, her usually steady hands trembling slightly as she examined the terrorist's body. She held up the recovered bullet with tweezers, her brow furrowed in a deep frown. The pristine copper jacket, the perfect rifling marks, it was all wrong. The bullet should have been deformed, mangled by its flight path and its final impact. Instead, it looked as if it had been fired from a short range into a soft target. It came from the northeast, approximately 2.3 kilometers out, Dr. Layla Voss announced to the gathering of bewildered investigators, her voice a strained whisper that struggled to contain a mounting sense of professional horror. On her tablet, a sterile holographic reconstruction of the crime scene rotated in the air before them, a digital testament to the surreal reality they were all facing. The trajectory analysis shows it passed through a gap no wider than 6 inches between two concrete pillars, a shot that should have been impossible even at close range. She trailed off, shaking her head slowly in profound disbelief, the motion a physical representation of her internal struggle. But here's what truly doesn't make sense. The bullet maintained perfect stability throughout its entire flight path. No tumbling, no deviation, no measurable loss of velocity. It's as if the wind, gravity, and obstacles simply didn't exist for it. Caleb felt his world tilting on its axis, every foundational pillar of his understanding of reality cracking under the immense pressure of the evidence. He stared at the ballistics report, a series of cold, hard numbers on a screen that seemed to mock everything he had ever learned about physics and marksmanship. The shot had required not just impossible accuracy, but a supernatural, godlike timing. Dr. Voss had been working closely with Dr. Elias Trent, the FBI's consulting physicist, a man whose reputation was built on his ability to explain the unexplainable, to bring clarity to chaos. But even he, the arbiter of scientific reason, was stumped. He'd meticulously modeled every possible trajectory, accounting for every variable, from the fierce gusting wind to the imperceptible spin of the Earth, and every single model came back with the same result: a dead end. The data was screaming at them, telling them the truth was a lie. There is no physical way for a bullet to travel from any position on that construction site to the target location, Doctor. Elias Trent stated, his voice a low, heavy monotone that struggled to contain the seismic shift occurring in his mind. He wasn't just reporting a fact, he was confessing to a profound intellectual failure, a crumbling of the very foundations of his scientific world. The concrete barriers create what we call a ballistic shadow, an area that is completely protected from direct fire. His words were a scientific condemnation of their entire investigation, an unyielding brick wall of logic that their reality was now crashing into with sickening force. A cold, hollow sensation bloomed in the pit of Caleb's stomach, a vacuum where his sense of certainty used to be. "So what are you saying, Doctor?" he asked, a question torn from his throat like a desperate gasp for air. He needed Trent to put a name to the phantom, to give him a tangible enemy to fight, even if that enemy was an idea. He needed a label for the monster, a category for the impossible, anything to prevent the utter chaos from swallowing him whole. He was a hunter, and a hunter needs a target, not a paradox. Dr. Trent met his gaze, his eyes wide and haunted, the look of a man who had stared into an abyss and found it staring back. "I'm saying that according to the laws of physics as we understand them, this shot never happened. It is an impossibility." He paused, gesturing with a trembling hand toward the scene of the crime. "And yet we have a dead terrorist and a recovered bullet that proves it did. It's a paradox, an unresolvable conflict between our data and our reality. Either our measurements are fundamentally wrong, or we're dealing with a technology, a capability that is so far beyond our own, it's not a step, but a leap across centuries of human understanding." The finality in his voice was absolute, a chilling pronouncement that stripped away every comforting certainty Caleb had ever held. Leaving the circle of bewildered investigators behind, Caleb and Logan moved like men in a trance toward the towering, rusted monument of their mystery, the old crane. Its yellow frame seemed to loom over the valley like a silent, indifferent god. Ground teams had already conducted a cursory search, but their faces told a story of futility. Caleb's eyes, however, were not on the ground but on the operator's cab, a solitary empty box suspended against the vast sky. It was a perfect vantage point for a sniper, and yet a geometrically impossible one. The air around them felt heavy, charged with a lingering presence. It was a primal, almost superstitious feeling, the sense that they were walking on the haunted ground of a forgotten god. As they neared the base of the crane, its cold steel and abandoned machinery a stark reminder of industrial decay, Logan's sharp, practiced eyes caught a flash of something out of place. A single, almost imperceptible detail that screamed of deliberate intent amidst the chaos. "Boss, over here," he said, his voice a tense whisper. He pointed to a small pile of discarded construction materials near the crane's access ladder. Nestled among the debris, almost completely hidden, was a small, unassuming hairpin. It was made of a plain black plastic, the kind you'd find in any drugstore. But something about it felt wrong. It felt too deliberate. Caleb knelt, using the tip of a pencil to lift the object carefully. It was a standard hairpin, a common mundane item you'd find in any drugstore, yet the way it sat on the ground, almost perfectly placed amidst the debris, felt less like a forgotten object and more like a deliberate breadcrumb left on a trail. He turned it over in his hand, the small plastic object suddenly feeling like an artifact from another world. Embedded in the plastic, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a tiny glinting object. "What is that?" Logan asked, his head cocked to one side, his voice a low, tense whisper. Caleb, using his multi-tool with the surgical precision of a bomb disposal expert, carefully pried the chip from the plastic. It was the size of a pinhead, and upon closer inspection he could make out a series of microscopic markings that spoke of technology far beyond their known capabilities. "It's a GPS chip," he breathed, the words a quiet thunderclap of realization in the vast silent space. "Military grade. The kind you'd find in a high-tech drone or a guided projectile. But it's not just a tracker. It's a positional beacon. It's designed to provide exact coordinates with centimeter accuracy." Logan's eyes widened, the implications hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "A beacon? So the shooter wasn't just shooting at a guy from a distance. They were shooting at a set of coordinates, like a guided missile. But that doesn't make sense. You can't guide a bullet. It's a dumb projectile. The words hung in the air, a desperate plea for logic in a world that was rapidly shedding its skin. "No," Caleb replied, his voice a low, tight rasp that seemed to cut through the swirling wind. The word was a final, damning dismissal of every theory they had entertained. "You're thinking of a bullet as a dumb projectile, Logan. But maybe you can tell a bullet exactly where to go. This isn't random. This isn't some rogue sniper with an impossibly lucky shot. This is a message. This is a sniper with technology that doesn't exist, a weapon that defies the very laws of our reality." His gaze, now fixed on the tiny chip in the evidence bag, was intense, almost reverent. This chip wasn't dropped by accident. It wasn't lost in the chaos. It was left here for us to find. The words hung in the air, a terrifying pronouncement of intent. The discovery of the GPS chip added a new, bone-chilling layer to the mystery. The phantom they had been hunting was no longer a supernatural anomaly, but a highly skilled operative, someone with access to technology so elite it was indistinguishable from magic. It was the cold, hard certainty of a human enemy, one whose capabilities were far beyond their comprehension. This wasn't just a shot, it was a statement, an act of audacious defiance, a cruel kind of artistry. The philosophical dread of the impossible had now been replaced by a more visceral, more terrifying fear, the fear of a human mind, a human will that had bent the universe to its own silent justice. The mystery was no longer a simple question of how, but a far more profound and unsettling one. Who, and more importantly, why? They were no longer hunting a ghost. They were a part of a ghost's game. And the rules had just been rewritten. The tiny military-grade GPS chip felt cold and insignificant in Caleb Navarro's palm, yet it was a key that had just unlocked a far more terrifying truth. This wasn't the work of a phantom. This was the work of a ghost with a fingerprint, a ghost that left behind a deliberate trail of breadcrumbs. The philosophical dread of the impossible had now been replaced by the cold, hard certainty of a human enemy. An enemy whose capabilities were so far beyond their comprehension they might as well be from another planet. Logan Price, his face a mask of stunned awe, stared at the tiny chip in the evidence bag, his mind racing to comprehend the implications. It was a marker, he breathed, the realization dawning on him like a cold, terrifying sunrise. They weren't just shooting from here. They were using this location as a coordinate, a reference point. But why? You can't guide a bullet. It's not a missile. His question hung in the air, a desperate plea for logic in a world that was rapidly shedding its skin of predictable physics. "No," Caleb replied, his voice low and tight with a new kind of resolve, the uncertainty from before replaced by a grim certainty. "You can't, but maybe you can tell a bullet exactly where to go. This wasn't dropped by accident. It was left here for us to find." The discovery of the chip had changed everything. It shifted the narrative from a supernatural event to a meticulously planned act of precision, an act that bordered on a cruel kind of artistry. The mystery was no longer a question of an impossible shot, but of a calculated, almost theatrical performance. The forensic teams, a sea of white suits against the grim backdrop of the industrial complex, were now working under the guidance of Dr. Layla Voss and Dr. Elias Trent. The scene of the crime was a puzzle, and they were the only ones equipped to put the pieces together. Caleb and Logan, their roles as snipers momentarily suspended, were now witnesses and key sources of information. They stood by as the experts meticulously documented every detail, every angle, every shadow. Each measurement a desperate attempt to find a single logical anchor in a sea of impossible data. "Dr. Voss," her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, stood over the body of Ivan Kovacs, a three-dimensional laser scanner whirring softly as it mapped the scene with pinpoint accuracy. The data was fed directly into a tablet, creating a holographic replica of the crime scene that floated in the air before them. It was a perfect, sterile recreation of the violent chaos that had unfolded hours ago. On the screen, the trajectory of the bullet was highlighted in a brilliant red line. It originated from the northeast, from the very location of the old crane. But as the simulation ran, the red line vanished abruptly, blocked by a simulated concrete barrier. The ballistic shadow was absolute. "It's the same result," Dr. Voss announced, her voice filled with a professional resignation that couldn't quite hide the bewilderment. "The shot is impossible from that position. The line of sight is completely obstructed. There's no angle, no ricochet, no window of opportunity that would allow a projectile to travel from the crane to the target. It simply doesn't work." Dr. Trent, the physicist, ran his own simulations on a separate laptop. His models, factoring in every conceivable variable, wind speed, barometric pressure, even the spin of the Earth, all confirmed the same impossible conclusion. Even if we assume a perfectly stable bullet fired at the perfect moment, the geometry of the obstacles makes it a non-starter. This is not a question of skill. This is a question of physics. The bullet would have to pass through solid matter to reach its target. Caleb's eyes were fixed on the screen, his mind trying to reconcile the image of a dead terrorist with the scientific certainty that he should still be alive. He was a man who believed in the tangible, in the cold, hard truth of a bullet's path. But the truth before him was neither cold nor hard. It was a paradox wrapped in an enigma. He found himself thinking about the little girl's eyes, the moment of impossible connection. He realized that the shooter, Maya Hayden, had not only defied physics, but had also defied the very essence of what a sniper does. A sniper is invisible, a ghost, but she had made sure they saw, she had made sure they knew. "The bullet," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the professional chatter, "the recovered 338 Lapua round. We need to look at it again. There must be something we're missing." Dr. Voss nodded, and the holographic image on her tablet shifted to a high-resolution scan of the bullet itself. The 338 Lapua round was a thing of beauty, designed for extreme long-range accuracy, but this one was pristine. It was shocking. After traveling over 2 kilometers and punching through a human skull, it should have been deformed, the tip blunted, the rifling grooves scarred by the force of impact. Instead, it was perfect. The copper jacket was smooth, the tip unblemished. It was as if it had passed through air, not bone and tissue. No tumbling, no deformation, no loss of velocity that we can detect, Dr. Voss confirmed, her voice a monotone of professional shock. "It's like it barely touched anything. The terminal ballistics, it makes no sense. The bullet acted as if the target was a soft, gelatinous mass, not a human skull. The implication hung in the air, a terrifying ghost in the machine, a bullet that didn't obey the rules of impact. A shot that didn't obey the rules of trajectory. The deeper they dug, the more impossible the story became. The forensics weren't lying, the numbers were absolute, but the reality they described was pure science fiction. As the evening wore on and the moon began to rise over the valley, casting long spectral shadows, the teams recovered security camera footage from the surrounding buildings. The cameras, positioned on a hill overlooking the construction site, offered a grainy black and white view of the crane. Dr. Voss and Dr. Trent huddled over a laptop, sifting through hours of footage, looking for a flash, a hint, a single frame that would betray the shooter's presence. And then they found it. They found it, a single fleeting anomaly in hours of monotonous security footage. The grainy black and white video from a traffic camera positioned on the hill overlooking the construction site was a low-quality window into a high-stakes mystery. Dr. Layla Voss, her finger hovering over the playback controls, leaned in close to the laptop screen, her breath catching in her throat. Caleb and Logan, their eyes glued to the screen, felt a jolt of raw anticipation. This was it. The moment of truth. "Watch the timestamp carefully," Dr. Voss instructed, her voice barely a whisper, as if a louder sound might frighten the truth away. The surveillance footage flickered to life on the screen, grainy and washed in the fading hues of twilight. From the fixed vantage point of a traffic camera mounted on a utility pole nearly a mile away, the construction crane stood tall in the distance. Its yellow frame silhouetted against the amber sky like the bones of a sleeping giant. The operator cab, a small silent chamber perched at the apex, was shrouded in shadows. There was nothing visibly unusual about it. No movement, no glint of glass, no sign of life. Intelligence reports had confirmed it had been abandoned for months. No maintenance records, no electrical drawer. Dead steel, inert. But then the timestamp in the top right corner of the footage, 3:47:22 p.m., ticked forward like the beat of a countdown, and at exactly 3:47:23 p.m. the video changed. Not dramatically, not like an explosion, not even like a shot fired. It was subtle, almost easy to miss, a shimmer, a distortion of air like the quivering waves above hot asphalt. It rippled just once, blooming outward from the operator cab in a soft pulse that bent the surrounding light. It didn't flash, it didn't flare. It whispered through the screen like an echo of something not meant to be seen. A pulse of heat, an energy signature, a mirage. Whatever it was, it lasted only a single frame, 1/30th of a second, before vanishing entirely. No sparks, no figure, no rifle barrel, and then, at 3:47:26 p.m., precisely 3 seconds later, Ivan Kovacs's skull erupted into a mist of blood and bone. Caleb Navarro, standing just behind the tech analyst, leaned in toward the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he tried to force meaning from the meaningless. "Run it again," he said, his voice steady but sharpened with confusion. The analyst rewound. Hit play. Same thing, the crane, the empty cab, the shimmer, the detonation of a human head across a concrete platform miles away. But this time, Caleb wasn't watching the crane. He was watching the edges, the frame, the air itself, and what he saw chilled him far more than any weapon ever could. Because there was nothing, no shooter, no weapon, no muzzle flash, no vibration in the camera, no pressure wave. It was as if the atmosphere itself had blinked, and in that blink death had traveled across a city with surgical precision. It defied not just physics, it defied presence. There was no evidence of movement, no access point, no exhaust, no trace of human interference. It was as if a decision had been made inside that cab, and reality had simply obeyed. Caleb straightened, his jaw tightening as he stepped back from the screen. It wasn't the shot that haunted him now, it was the absence, the silence, the intent, the eerie elegance of a kill that left no signature, only consequences. And somewhere out there, the person who had done it wasn't hiding. They were watching. Logan, who had been silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke up, his voice hushed with a dawning horror. "What if we're looking at this all wrong?" He pulled out his own tablet showing a satellite image of the construction site. "Look at the crane's position. The jib extends out over the valley, but there are maintenance platforms along its length. Someone could have positioned themselves anywhere along that arm. They wouldn't have to be in the cab." Dr. Voss shook her head grimly, her gaze unwavering. "We thought of that. We've analyzed every possible shooting position along the crane structure, from the base to the tip of the jib. The problem isn't just the distance, Logan. It's the angle. From any position on that crane, the shot would have required the bullet to pass through solid concrete. The barriers that were protecting Kovacs should have made him completely invisible to any shooter in that area. It's a fundamental truth of geometry. A straight line is a straight line. The group fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't just dealing with an impossible shot. They were dealing with a shot that violated the basic laws of physics. Bullets couldn't curve around obstacles or pass through solid matter. Yet somehow one had done exactly that. The pristine condition of the bullet, the inexplicable heat shimmer, the impossible trajectory, it all pointed to a truth so terrifying it was easier to dismiss it as a collective delusion. Dr. Elias Trent, the physicist, had been quietly running calculations on his laptop throughout the discussion, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his face a grim mask of concentration. Now he looked up with an expression of scientific bewilderment that Caleb had never seen before. "I've modeled every possible trajectory, every variable, every conceivable ricochet scenario," he announced, his voice thin and strained, as if the words themselves were physically painful to utter. "I have modeled for wind, gravity, air density, even the Coriolis effect, and every single model comes back with the same conclusion. There is no physical way for a bullet to travel from any position on that construction site to the target location. The concrete barriers create what we call a ballistic shadow, an area that is completely protected from direct fire." "So what are you saying, Doctor?" Caleb asked again, the question now a desperate plea for an answer, any answer. "I'm saying that according to the laws of physics, this shot never happened, Doctor," Trent replied, his voice carrying the weight of a man whose fundamental understanding of reality had just been shattered. "Yet we have a dead terrorist and a recovered bullet that proves it did. It's an unresolvable paradox. Either our measurements are all fundamentally wrong, or we're dealing with a technology that's decades, possibly a century, ahead of anything currently known to exist. A bullet that can be fired from an impossible position, that can travel through what should be an impenetrable obstacle, and that can arrive at a location before its target even gets there. That's not a sniper, that's a god." Caleb's world, a world built on logic, on the predictable paths of a bullet and the cold, hard rules of engagement, was crumbling. The reality he knew had been replaced by something far more complex and terrifying. The shooter, Maya Hayden, was a ghost, a paradox, an entity that operated outside of time and space, a being that bent reality to her will to deliver a single perfect act of justice. The mystery was no longer a puzzle to be solved, it was a truth to be endured. The forensics didn't lie, the numbers were absolute, but the story they told was a nightmare. The truth was a heavy, cold weight, settling in Caleb Navarro's gut like a block of ice. The forensics didn't lie. The physics didn't lie. The impossible shot was a fact, a ghost in the machine of their investigation. While Dr. Layla Voss and Dr. Elias Trent continued to grapple with the paradoxical evidence, Caleb knew the real answers wouldn't be found in data sets or ballistic models. They would be found in the one place they knew the ghost had been, the old tower crane, leaving the white-suited investigators to their scientific bewilderment, their sterile world of data and models unable to compute the impossible. Caleb and Logan made their way back to the foot of the towering yellow crane. The GPS chip, now securely sealed in an evidence bag, was no longer just a piece of a puzzle. It was a constant, humming reminder of the deliberate nature of this mystery, a breadcrumb dropped by a ghost. "She left it for us," Caleb said, his voice low and firm, a new kind of certainty hardening his resolve. "This isn't a puzzle to be solved, it's a personal invitation." Their ascent began. The climb up the rusted, creaking ladder to the operator's cab was more than a physical act. It was a visceral manifestation of their professional crisis. Each rusted rung was a question. each upward step a step further away from the predictable world they had dedicated their lives to protecting. The wind, which had been a tormentor during the hostage crisis, now felt like a taunting presence, a low, mocking whisper of the power that had bent it to its will. It was the breath of the phantom, a reminder that they were now on her turf, playing by her rules. As Caleb climbed, his mind replayed the scene, the heat shimmer on the camera footage, the pristine bullet, the impossible timing. It all added up to one conclusion. The shooter, Maya Hayden, had not just made a shot. She had orchestrated an act of defiance against reality itself. The goal wasn't just to kill the terrorist, it was to leave an undeniable, unexplainable mark on their world. She wanted them to know. She wanted Caleb to know. Finally, they reached the top. The view from the operator's cab was breathtaking. A panoramic vista of the entire valley spread out below like a miniature model. He could see the building where the hostage situation had unfolded, the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles, now a distant, silent symphony. But from this vantage point, the concrete barriers completely obscured the position where Ivan Kovacs had been standing. Dr. Trent's model was right. There was no line of sight. It was a physical impossibility. Caleb's eyes, however, weren't focused on the crime scene. They were scanning the small enclosed space of the cab itself. It was dusty and abandoned, littered with old newspapers and a coffee cup thick with mold. The ghost had been here, but she had left no trace. No fingerprints, no residue, nothing. But Caleb knew a ghost didn't leave a GPS chip without a reason. She was a sniper, a master of misdirection. He had to think like her. He had to look for what wasn't there. He ran his hand along the steel walls of the cab, his fingers searching for a flaw, a secret, a place where a ghost might leave a message. And then he felt it. A small piece of paper, folded precisely, wedged into a tiny gap between two steel plates near a defunct control panel. It was a detail a cleaning crew would have missed, a detail a sniper, with her meticulous attention to detail, would have known to be the perfect hiding spot. With trembling fingers, he extracted the paper and unfolded it. On the small slip, written in a precise, almost calligraphic handwriting, were a series of numbers and letters. Coordinates: 41.261 9095.86 AW. What is it, boss? Logan asked, his voice full of an anxious curiosity. Coordinates, Caleb replied, the single word, a quiet thunderclap of realization. She's still guiding us. She's telling us where to go next. The coordinates traced a silent line to a derelict warehouse on the edge of the city, 15 miles from the site where Ivan Kovacs had fallen. On the surface, it looked like nothing, an old freight distribution center long since forgotten by shipping companies, surrounded by chain-link fences warped by rust and time. To the untrained eye, it held no tactical significance, no vantage point, no field of fire, no direct correlation to the crisis they had just survived. But Caleb Navarro wasn't looking with an untrained eye. He knew, felt, that this wasn't arbitrary. Whoever left that GPS chip had chosen this place deliberately. The ride there was a slow-motion procession of flashing red and blue lights against grey concrete and dying daylight. Inside the lead SUV, Caleb sat stone still beside Logan, the radio chatter buzzing in the background like static ghosts. No one spoke. No one dared guess what they'd find. The FBI tactical unit had taken command of the operation, moving with urgency but without conviction. Because they weren't chasing a suspect anymore, they were chasing something that wanted to be found, and that, more than anything, unnerved them. It wasn't a manhunt, it was a breadcrumb trail left by a phantom marksman, someone who could have vanished without a trace, but instead left clues, coordinates, a chip embedded in a hairpin, not to escape but to be understood or warned. And that quiet message was far more dangerous than any overt threat. As they neared the warehouse, even the most seasoned agents in the convoy could feel it, a shift in the air. This wasn't just about evidence, it was about revelation. The rules had changed, and they were walking willingly into something far bigger than a single impossible shot. When they arrived, the warehouse was a vast, empty expanse of concrete and shadow. Dust motes danced in the lone shafts of moonlight that pierced the grime-streaked windows. The air was still and cold, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the crime scene. There, in the center of the vast empty floor, was their next clue, a single spent casing, A338 Lapua Magnum round. The single spent casing lay on the cold concrete floor of the abandoned warehouse, a silent, damning piece of evidence that defied all logic. It was A338 Lapua Magnum round, the same caliber as the bullet recovered from Ivan Kovacs's skull. Caleb knelt down, his fingers hovering over the brass. It was still faintly warm to the touch, a ghost of heat that spoke of a recent, terrifying presence. The air itself seemed to hum with a residual energy, a lingering echo of an act that should have been impossible. Dr. Layla Voss, her face etched with a look of profound disbelief, was the first to speak. The ballistics, the rifling marks will match, she said, her voice a strained whisper. This casing came from the same weapon that fired the bullet. But that's not possible. The warehouse has a clear view of nothing but empty farmland. There is no line of sight to the hostage location. No way for a shot fired from this position to reach its target. The room was filled with the silent, collective dread of men whose world had just been shattered. They were standing in a physical testament to a paradox. The bullet, a cold, hard fact, had traveled an impossible distance from an impossible angle and had arrived at its destination from a location that should have been completely irrelevant. The spent casing, another cold, hard fact, proved it had been fired from a place that could not possibly have hit the target. The evidence was a lie, and yet it was all they had. Logan, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe, swept his flashlight across the vast empty space. It's like a magic trick, the classic misdirection. She wants us to focus on the impossible shot from the crane, while the real impossible shot was fired from here. But Caleb knew it was more complex than that. The coordinates had led them here. The GPS chip had been at the crane. The ghost was playing a game with them, a game where the rules were unknown and the stakes were reality itself. He lowered his flashlight beam to the floor, illuminating the area directly beside the spent casing. There, burned into the concrete floor as if by a searing hot acid, were words. Some shots demand silence, some justice leaves no trace. The words were not written, but etched with surgical precision, the letters a perfect, crystalline scar on the unforgiving surface of the concrete. It was a message, another breadcrumb left by the phantom sniper. But what did it mean? What kind of weapon could etch words into concrete with a laser-like precision and then fire a bullet with the same uncanny physics-defying power? Dr. Voss, her professional curiosity overpowering her fear, knelt down to examine the etching. This wasn't done with acid, she murmured, her voice filled with a mixture of professional awe and dawning terror. The edges are too clean, too perfect. This looks like it was done with an energy source. A laser, maybe, a high-powered one, but there's no equipment here, no power source, nothing. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. The ghost, Maya Hayden, was not just a sniper. She was a creator, a wielder of a technology that was a century beyond their grasp. She could bend time, space, and reality to her will, all to deliver a single perfect act of justice. The shot from the crane, the impossible trajectory, the pristine bullet, the etched message, it was all a symphony of impossibility, a carefully choreographed performance designed to shatter their understanding of the world. As night fell over the warehouse, Caleb stood alone in the darkness, holding the spent casing and trying to make sense of a world that no longer followed the rules he understood. Somewhere out there was a shooter who could make bullets travel impossible distances, curve around obstacles, and arrive at their targets before they were even fired. The question that haunted him wasn't just who they were, but what they were, and whether they were even human at all. The case file would remain officially unsolved, but Caleb would carry the truth with him forever, that in a world of limitations and impossibilities, there were still those who refused to accept either. The Phantom Sniper was a force of nature, a silent judge, and he was a witness to her verdict. And he knew with a chilling certainty that this was just the beginning. The ghost had left him clues, not to find her, but to prepare him. For what, he did not know, but he knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and electrifying that their paths were now intertwined, and he was now a player in a game with rules he couldn't possibly comprehend. The silent justice had just begun. For Caleb Navarro, the world had been fractured into two distinct periods, life before the shot and life after. The 3 weeks that followed the incident were a descent into a private hell of restless nights and waking nightmares. Sleep became a battlefield where fractured physics and impossible geometries waged a war against his sanity. The official report, a cold and clinical document, was a sanitized lie. Stripped of all the impossible details that made it a terrifying truth, it read like a work of mediocre fiction. Unknown sniper eliminates terrorist threat from undetermined position. The dry, bureaucratic language was a flimsy shield, a desperate institutional attempt to make the inexplicable mundane, to file away the impossible as an administrative anomaly. But Caleb knew the truth. And it was a poison, a slow-acting venom that was eating him alive from the inside out. He sat alone in the sterile solitude of his apartment, the spent 338 Lapua casing from the warehouse resting on his coffee table. It was more than a piece of evidence, it was a silent accusation, a physical tether to the event that had shattered his reality. He had never officially reported it, a cardinal sin for a federal agent, but the truth was he couldn't. It was a piece of a puzzle too large, too terrifying for the human mind to process. The nightmares had started immediately. Dreams where bullets curved through the air with a malevolent grace, like guided missiles obeying an invisible will. Dreams where shadows moved with deadly precision through impossible geometries, and where time itself seemed to bend and warp around the desires of an unseen marksman. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his sheets soaked with perspiration, the metallic taste of copper and the acrid flavor of fear coating his tongue. The image of a single perfect bullet burned into his mind's eye. His phone, a mundane piece of technology, buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple, stark, and terrifyingly direct. There was no greeting, no context, just a command: rooftop now. Come alone, bring the casing. Caleb stared at the message for a full minute, his heart hammering against his ribs, a primal scream of every instinct telling him to stay inside, to call for backup, to pretend he'd never received the message. This was a trap, this was a delusion, but the truth was simpler and more terrifying. He was being summoned, and he had to go. The ghost had left him a trail, a series of clues designed for him alone. To ignore the final clue would be to accept the lie, and he couldn't do that. Not anymore. Against every screaming instinct, Caleb grabbed his service weapon and the casing, then climbed the narrow stairs to his building's roof. The December wind, colder and more unforgiving than before, cut through his jacket like a scalpel. The city lights below seemed to pulse with an otherworldly rhythm that made his vision swim. He was walking into a mystery, and he knew with a bone-deep certainty that he wouldn't be walking out the same man. She was standing at the edge of the roof, her silhouette barely visible against the city lights, as if she were made of shadow and starlight rather than flesh and blood. Maya Hayden. He couldn't make out her features, but something about her posture suggested coiled power, a predator at rest but ready to strike, a silent, deadly stillness that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. He stopped a respectful distance away, the cold air between them a palpable barrier of tension and unspoken questions. When she spoke, her voice was calm, yet it carried an accent he couldn't place. Something European, maybe Russian, but filtered through years of careful cultivation. "You've been asking questions, Agent Navarro," she said without turning around, her voice a low, melodic whisper carried on the wind, disturbing the careful balance that keeps certain truths hidden from those who aren't ready to understand them. Caleb found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended, a raw sound in the biting wind. "Who are you? How did you make that shot?" She turned then, and Caleb saw a face that was sharp, angular, with the kind of beauty that suggested danger rather than comfort. Her eyes seemed to hold the weight of 100 impossible shots, 1,000 calculated deaths delivered from distances that defied comprehension. She appeared to be in her 30s, but there was an ageless quality to her gaze, a deep, weary wisdom that suggested she'd seen far more than any human lifetime should contain. "The shot was impossible because you were thinking like a sniper instead of thinking like physics," she said, taking a step closer, her movement silent, her feet seemingly barely touching the rooftop gravel. "You assume bullets must travel in straight lines. That cause must precede effect. That distance is an absolute barrier rather than a relative inconvenience." "That's insane," Caleb whispered, his own words sounding hollow and frail against the crushing certainty in her voice. But even as he said it, he felt the certainty of his worldview crumbling like sand, falling away to reveal a new, terrifying landscape. Bullets can't curve around obstacles. They can't travel through time. She smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression Caleb had ever seen. Not cruel, but infinitely patient, like a teacher explaining basic arithmetic to a child. "The bullet didn't travel in a straight line, Agent Navarro. It was fired from a place of perfect silence and perfect justice. The coordinates led you there. That was the point of origin." She gestured toward the spent casing in his hand. The crane, the impossible angle, the heat shimmer, those were all just the point of delivery. The bullet was not fired from the crane, it was sent to the crane. It materialized there, and then at the precise moment it was needed, it was delivered to the target. All I did was set the parameters. The technology did the rest. Caleb's mind reeled. A bullet that could be fired from one location and then sent to another to be delivered to a target. It was a level of technological superiority so profound it was indistinguishable from magic. She continued, her voice soft but firm. "You're thinking like a federal agent, Agent Navarro. But some problems can't be solved with handcuffs and a Miranda warning. Some justice can't be contained within the geometry of your world." "What are you?" he asked, the question torn from his throat like a confession. "I'm what happens when someone refuses to accept that justice has limitations," she replied, stepping backward toward the edge of the roof, her silhouette once again becoming one with the shadows. "When someone decides that distance, time, and physics are merely suggestions rather than absolute laws. The child lived because someone needed to die, and I was in a position to make that happen. My shot demanded silence and left no trace, because that is the nature of the justice it delivered. But why? Why save her? Why reveal yourself to me?" he pleaded, a final, desperate attempt to understand the ghost, the woman who had shattered his world. She paused at the very edge of the roof, balanced on the precipice like a dancer frozen in mid-leap. "Because some shots require witnesses, Agent Navarro. because some truths need to be remembered even if they can never be officially recorded, and because someday when you're faced with another impossible situation, you'll remember that impossible is just another word for what hasn't been done yet. Before Caleb could respond, she stepped backward off the roof, and when he rushed to the edge, there was nothing below but empty air and the growing, terrifying realization that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved. The only evidence she'd ever been there was the spent casing in his pocket and the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness, Justice wore a human face and carried a weapon that could rewrite the laws of reality. As Caleb stood alone on the rooftop, staring into the abyss where she'd vanished, he understood that his life had been divided into two parts, before the impossible shot and after, and he would spend the rest of his days wondering if he'd encountered an angel of death, a time traveler, or something far stranger than either. The case file would remain officially unsolved, but Caleb would carry the truth with him forever, and so, officially, the case was closed. Not solved, but simply filed away, a ghost in the annals of law enforcement, a cold file in an evidence room, a mystery deemed too improbable to ever be marked as anything but unsolved. But for Caleb Navarro, the case would never truly be over. It lives on, a haunting presence that permeates the silence of his apartment, in the relentless torment of his sleepless nights, in the tangible, disquieting weight of the spent casing he keeps tucked away in a locked box, a single, silent piece of evidence that tells a story no one would ever believe. It is the story of a man who looked into the scope of his rifle, a lens through which he had always viewed a predictable world of physics and geometry, and saw the end of that world as he knew it, only to have it rewritten, not by a pen, but by a ghost. The final words of Maya Hayden, a voice that was both a whisper and a thunderclap, echo in his mind, a constant low thrum beneath the surface of his thoughts. Impossible is just a word for what hasn't been done yet. It's a terrifying truth, but also, in a strange and profound way, a liberating one. It shattered his world, yes, but it also opened his eyes to a new one. A world where the rules are not as absolute as he once believed. A world where justice, a concept he had always thought of as bound by legalities and limitations, can find a way, even when all the known paths are blocked. He is no longer just a sniper, a man who lives and dies by the predictable laws of ballistics and the straight-line path of a bullet. He is something else now. He is a witness, a keeper of a secret so profound it could change everything. A secret that tells him that there are forces at work in the world that he can't comprehend, powers that exist outside of his understanding, and that the only thing more dangerous than not knowing the truth is living with it, alone, in the quiet solitude of his own mind. What do you think? Was Maya Hayden an angel of justice or something far more dangerous? Was her act a benevolent miracle or a chilling demonstration of a power too great for humanity to comprehend? We want to hear your thoughts. The truth in stories like these is often found in the discussion. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the impossible. Here at Veteran Biker, we're passionate about stories that challenge the status quo, stories that make you question what you know to be true. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows, be sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next adventure. We've got more tales of impossible shots and unseen heroes waiting for you. And if you're looking for another story that bends the rules of reality, check out the videos appearing on your screen now. They're sure to give you something to think about. Until next time, ride safe and keep your eyes open. You never know when you might witness the impossible.